Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Hidla aleha es hagefen ve'es hadalas ve'es hakisos v'sichech al gaba pesula. We saw this quoted by the Gemara just yesterday, that if a person takes vines or ivy and pulls them over the sukkah as chach, then that's not kosher. V'im hayasichach harbe mehen, oh shekitzutsan keshera. The exception would be that if you already have kosher schach that outnumbers the ivy or the vines, then the ivy is bottled to the kosher schach that we had seen yesterday as well, provided that you mix it in. And then the other issue that we're going to be dealing with is, or if you clip it, after you drape the ivy over, and then you clip it from its growth, so then it's also kosher. Zeh klal. And the general rule is, Kol davar shehu mekabel tuma ve'in gidulo min haaretz ein mesachachin bo, v'chol davar she'eno mekabel tuma ve'gidulo min haaretz mesachachin bo. The rule is that if something is not subject to tuma, something that is subject to tuma and does not grow from the ground, such a thing is not kosher for schach. But if something is not mekabel tuma and it grows from the ground, meaning that it's not a kli, it's not a food item that would be makabel tuma, but rather it's vegetation, so then you can use it as chach. And the Gemara will clarify this. And the Gemara will try and explain to us why we needed a klal. The Gemara now says, Yosef Rav Yosef kamei de Rav Huna v'Yosef u'ka'amar. The Gemara records a maisa that once Rav Yosef was sitting in the presence of Rav Huna, and he made the following statement. O shekatzitsan keshera, on the statement that if you clip the ivy, once already after you've draped it onto the sukkah, it's kosher. V'amar Rav tzarech linaneya. Rav said there's one more proviso. It's not just enough to clip it, you also have to lift up each vine and then let it rest back down in order to fulfill the precept that we're going to learn about momentarily, which is called ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. The Torah says, Chag HaSukkos ta'aseh lecha. You have to actually assemble a sukkah. If a sukkah assembles it by itself, the classic example would be is that, let's say I take a tractor that has a plow on it, and I have a really, really tall field, and I plow through some very thick brush so that I've created like a little cave of vegetation. That's not a kosher sukkah, because I haven't assembled the sukkah. I've just created a cave with the sukkah already having been there all around me. Okay, so that's not a kosher sukkah. In a similar vein, if the sukkah has non-kosher schach, and after that non-kosher schach has been assembled, something happens such that the schach is now kosher, that's also a problem of, well, it hasn't been assembled with the proper ingredients. After it's been assembled, then the ingredients become kosher. So that's not acceptable, Rav says, and therefore the assembly has to be done with kosher ingredients. So therefore you have to, because the ivy only became kosher after it was assembled, you have to do an act of assembly by lifting it up and putting it down in order to do that new assembly properly.
Specifically for schach.
It's specifically for schach.
Have walls beforehand.
You can have walls beforehand, yes, because the schach is the definition of the sukkah. Yes, that's an important point. Okay, Amar le Rav Huna Hashmuel Amra. So Rav Huna hears Rav Yosef quoting Rav as saying that you have to shake the schach, and Rav Huna turns to Rav Yosef and says, "Excuse me, Rav Yosef, it was Shmuel said that." In other words, you're quoting Rav, but Shmuel actually said it. So Ahadrinu Rav Yosef la'ape. So Rav Yosef gave him a stern glance. He said, "Va'amar le atu mika amina lach delo amar Shmuel amar Rav va'amar Shmuel." I've never said that Shmuel didn't say it. I just said that Rav said it. So maybe Rav said it and Shmuel said it. So Amar le Rav Huna hachi ka amina lach de Shmuel amra v'lo Rav. No, Rav Huna says, what I'm trying to explain to you is that there's a machlokus between Rav and Shmuel. Shmuel is the one who holds that you have to shake the schach, and Rav holds that you don't have to shake the schach. The Rav achshuri machshir ki hada Rav amrim chasida. because Rav holds that it's kosher even by just doing the snip, by just clipping the ivy. That's enough of an act of assembly without having to lift up the schach. And my proof is the statement of Rav Amram Chasida, because there was once a Maisa that Rama Techilta leparzuma de inshi besi tala'an velo pasak roshechutin shalahem. Here was the case. Rav Amram Chasida wanted to make tzitzis for his entire family, including his wife, because Rav Amram Chasida felt that the mitzvah of tzitzis is not a mitzvah aseh shazman grama. He felt that the mitzvah applies at night as well as day, and therefore my wife has to wear tzitzis too.
Recent blogs, right?
Yeah, create talk about controversies. Yeah.
That's next after tefillin.
Yeah, right.
Oh, I see. It's on your video.
So anyway, so what he did was, but that's not bad enough. In other words, the objectionable part is not that he wanted to put tzitzis on for his wife. The question was the way that he assembled the strings on the tzitzis. He took one long string and stuck it through the corner hole, and then doubled it over a couple of times so that you would end up with 8 strings. So, and then, because you have to have 4 double strings and not just one multiple doubled string, he snipped it at the appropriate place to end up with 8 strings. And the question was, is that a valid assembly of tzitzis or not? Because it's really theoretically, technically it's not, it really wasn't assembled as the requisite number of strings. It was assembled with only 1 string. So the question, Asal Kame de Rav Chia bar Ashi, Amar Lei, Hachi Amar Rav, Mefaskan Vehin Kesherin. So he came to Rav Chia bar Ashi and asked him, is this kosher? And Rav Chia bar Ashi told him, Rav Paskind, that even though we have a similar halacha by tzitzis, that it has to be assembled properly with the kosher materials, part of the assembly is the snipping, and therefore it's a kosher assembly. Even though you put in the strings when they weren't kosher for tzitzis, because it was doubled over, but since you snipped it after the fact, the snipping itself is part of the assembly, and therefore it's okay. So alma pisikasan zuhi asiyasan hachanami kitzitzasan zuhi asiyasan. So you see that the snipping of the strings is considered to be part of the assembly, and so too the clipping of the ivy would be considered to be part of the assembly, and therefore that's all you need to do according to Rav. Benny, you came for a second time to the DAF today. You want a chazer, huh? Benny was here at the early DAF too.
I got a party today.
So okay, good. So the Gemara now says, "V'savar Shmuel lo amrinan pisikasan zuhi asiyasan," and the Gemara now says, "You mean to tell me that Shmuel does not hold that the snipping is considered to be an assembly? V'hatani Shmuel mishum Rabbi Chia hitul l'shnei kranos bevas echas v'achar kach pasak rashechutim shalahen kesherin." Shmuel has a similar statement. Shmuel's statement is that if you put the strings through 2 corners instead of putting the strings through 1 corner, and then after you've put them through 2 corners, you then and you've attached them to the corners, and then you snip them. So then Shmuel says that that's kosher. So my lav shekosher v'achar kach posek, and the assumption is that after affixing through knotting the strings to each corner, basically what you do is you take a beged and you fold it in half. You fold it over. And then you have your holes, you align the holes of 2 corners together, and you stick in the strings through both of them. The Gemara's assumption is, Shmuel says that that's kosher as long as you snip the strings afterwards. The assumption is that you tied your knots to each corner, and then you snipped it. So therefore it seems like snipping is considered to be an act of assembly according to Shmuel.
Why didn't Mari just use a very simple example of just cutting the corner? Not just tzitzis. If the corner is not square, then that's not tzitzis.
No, the reason is because we're talking about clipping something. That's
the corner itself, make it into a square. If it was a circle, it wouldn't be chayiv, and the second you put on the tzitzis.
I think this is more analogous, because here we're talking about like a string of ivy, and here we're talking about the string of the tzitzis. It seems like, at least conceptually, this is more analogous. I hear your argument as well. That would also be an issue, but there it would almost be like that would be more analogous to the case of where you put up the schach and you haven't put up the walls yet, which the Gemara is going to talk about. The Gemara will talk about that. I believe the Gemara talks about that later. In any event, lo sheposek v'achar kach kosher. So the Gemara says, no, that's not what Shmuel was saying was kosher. Shmuel was only arguing that it's kosher if you put the strings through two corners, and before you tie the knots, before you knot it and actually affix it to the corner, you cut the strings in half. Only there is it kosher. But if taka, you tied it and then you clipped the strings, then it would not be kosher because of the same problem. So the Gemara says, posek v'achar kach kosher, mai lememra. So I don't understand, says the Gemara. You haven't assembled it properly yet. So why would you even think that there's a problem of putting it through two holes and then clipping and then snipping the strings in half? The Gemara says, Mahu detema, bo'inan kanaf bishas pesil v'leka kamash malan. You might have thought that based on the verbiage of the pasuk, the Torah says that you have to make tzitzis on the corner using a thread of techeles. So you might think that the actual placing the string into the corner even before you tie it has to be done with a proper assembly of only one corner at a time. That's what you might have thought, and you haven't fulfilled that because you've put it through two corners instead of one corner, and therefore even in that case it's not kosher. Kamash malan, that it's kosher, and you can clip it as long as you haven't yet tied it. That's all Shmuel is saying. So meisvei. So now let's challenge. We're going to bring a challenge. We'll see who this challenge is in just a second. Tala'an velo pasak rashe chutin shalahen pesulin. That if you place the strings in the corners and you haven't yet snipped the strings, meaning presumably you're talking about the same case where you put in one long string into a corner and then afterwards you clip it, so it's puzzle. So my lav psulin la'olam, doesn't that imply that it's always puzzle v'tiyuf to the Rav? This is a challenge to Rav, because Rav holds as long as you clip the strings, then it's going to be kosher. So the Gemara says, Amar lecha Rav, no, my psulin ad she'i pasku. No, Rav will tell you, no, it's puzzle so long as the strings have not been clipped. But once you snip the strings, then it's perfectly kosher, because you don't require tasav v'lo asui, because it's not a problem of tasav v'lo asui, because the actual clipping of the strings is an act of assembly. Ushmuel amar pesulun la'olam. And Shmuel says no. Shmuel holds l'shitaso, that's a problem of after the fact, after it's already been fully assembled, you're trying to rectify it, and therefore it's not okay. And it's never going to be okay. That tzitzis would have to be completely untied and removed off of the corner, and then reassembled in order for it to be kosher. V'chein Amar Levi, Amar Shmuel, Pesulun la'olam. And Levi's quoted that in the name of Shmuel as well. V'chein Amar Rav Masna, Amar Shmuel, Pesulun la'olam, and Rav Masna quoted Shmuel as well. Ika da Amri, others say the version as follows. Amar Rav Masna b'didi hava uvda v'asoi l'kami demar Shmuel v'amar li psulun la'olam. Some say that Rav Masna said, not only did Shmuel say it, but I actually had a case where I had assembled the tzitzis with non-kosher strings first, and then I clipped it, and I wanted to ask him if it's kosher, and he told me, no, it's pasul la'olam. You have to completely take it apart in order to make it kosher. Meisvei. Now let's bring another challenge. Talan v'achar kach pasak rashi chutin shalahen pesulin. That if you place the strings in, and only afterwards you clip the strings, then it's pasul. Va'otanya gabe sukkah, and the same thing is taught in regard to the laws of sukkah. That ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asoi, based on that pasuk of Chag HaSukkos ta'aseh, make or assemble sukkahs, mikan amru hidla aleas hagefen v'sadalas v'sakisos v'sichich al gaban pesula. That if you take ivy or vine and drape it over the sukkah and then afterwards clip it, it's going to be pasul. So heichi damis. So the Gemara now, that's the end of the brisa. The question is, what is the case? Ilema b'shelo kitzatsan my irya misham tasav lo min ha'asui tepak leide mechubarin ninu. If you're going to tell me that the reason the sukkah is pasul is because the ivy has not been clipped, and therefore it's not kosher schach because it's still mechuber lekarka, still attached to the ground, well then don't tell me that the reason why the sukkah is pasul is because of tasav v'lo min ha'asui. Tell me it's pasul because the schach is not kosher. So ella b'shekitzatzan uketani pesula. So it must be telling me that even after you clip the ivy, the sukkah is pasul. And it must therefore be telling me, this brisa, that just the act of clipping or snipping a string or a rope or a piece of ivy is not enough of an act of assembly to rectify an after-the-fact assembly. So this is a kasha on Rav. So hold on one second. So Amar Lecha Rav will tell you no. Hacha b'mayaskinan deshalfinu shalufe delo minkara asiya didhu. So the Gemara answers that no. Rav will tell you that the only reason why this is puzzle is because you didn't do an overt act of snipping the vine, in this case of the brisa. What you did instead is that you draped the growing ivy over your sukkah, and then instead of using a shears to clip it, you gently pulled out the ivy from its roots, and you left it just lying there on the ground. So it's not overt, it's not evident that this ivy is uprooted and clipped. And therefore that's not enough, even Rav would agree, that that's not enough of an act of overt assembly for it to surmount the problems of Tasav Lamina Asui. It has to be noticeable, at least, that you've done an act of assembly, and that's not noticeable enough. Okay? So, Mikol Makom, Talan V'achar Kach Pasa Kasha L'Rav. But the Gemara says, yes, okay, fine. So you'll say that that's how he'll explain the case of the sukkah. But the first part of the brisa, which said the case of Rav, where you put in one string and tie it to the corner of the garment, and then you cut it into kosher and tzitzis, we said that that's puzzle according to the brisa. So isn't that case a kasha to Rav? The Gemara says kasha. Yes, you're right. It is a kasha. So yes.
Yeah, you pretty much answered. But I mean, what I was thinking was, if such an overt act that you say, the shame mitzvah sukkah, and you cut it, right? In other words, that you're really showing through your kavanah that you're doing that.
So Rav says that that's enough. Shmuel says it's not enough, because no matter how much you intend for it to be a sukkah, it's not enough of a maisa. It's not enough of an act, because the schach has already come to a rest in its destination. So that's considered already assembled. So the Gemara now says, Lema kitanai. At least in order to save Rab, we have clearly a brisa that goes against him. So let us suggest that there's a machlokas of brises, a machlokas tanoim. So as it says as follows: Avar v'liktan pasal divrei Reb Shimon bar Yehud Sadak, and v'chachamim machshirin. That if a person, now here we're not even talking about sukkah or tzitzis. We're talking about a halacha of the Yom Tov of sukkahs, but here we're talking about the arba minim. We're talking about your lulav and esrog. We're going to see later on that the hadas, some species of hadas grow with little berries. And you're not allowed to have a proliferation of berries on your hadas because it's not considered to be nice. It's not considered to be a beautification of the mitzvah. And therefore, if you have an abundance of berries, you have to pluck them off. If, let's say you've already put your arba minim together, and it's now first day of Yom Tov, you're not allowed to remove the berries. You can't remove the berries on Yom Tov. B'diavad, what if you did remove the berries already? So there you have a machlokas. Rabbi Shimon says Reb Shimon bar Yehud Sadak says it's pasul, and the Chachamim say that it's kosher b'diavad. So savrua de kuli alma lulav tzarech eged v'yalfinu lulav misukah d'chsiv gabi sukkah tasav lo mina asui. So the original thinking of as how to understand this machlokas is that a lulav has to be assembled in order to put all four species together. You have to tie them together. And just like we learn by the sukkah, it has to be assembled in a state of kashrus, when all the ingredients are kosher. So too, when you assemble the arba minim, all four ingredients of the arba minim have to be kosher in advance. And therefore, my lav b'hakam iflagi. And therefore, the assumption is that the machlokas between Reb Shimon bar Yehud Sadak and the Chachamim is as follows: Deman demachshir savar amrinan gabe sukkah kitzitzasan zuhi asiyasan, begabe lulav nami amri lekitasan zuhi asiyasan. That if uman de posel savar lo amrinan gabe sukkah kitzitzasan zuhi asiyasan, begabe lulav nami lo amrinan lekitasan zuhi asiyasan. The assumption is like this: that if you hold like Rav and you say that clipping a string or clipping a piece of ivy is enough of an act of assembly, so therefore even after I've already assembled my arba minim by tying them together, I can remove the berries, because the removal of berries is like clipping a string. And therefore that's enough of a post-assembly act in order to avoid the problem of tasa v'lo mina asui. And that's the Chachamim. But Reb Shimon bar Yehoshua will hold like Shmuel, who says that no, just clipping or removing something is not enough of an act of assembly, and therefore it's not going to be kosher, because It's already after the fact of its full assembly. So the Gemara says, lo. No, that's not how to understand this machlokas tanoim, because I could explain it another way. Dekuli alma lo omrin and gabi sukkah kitzitzas and zuhi yasiyas, because maybe I'll tell you that according to everybody, we hold that clipping is not enough of an act of assembly. V'hacha b'meilef lulav misukah kamiflagi. And really, the whole machlokas is, do we learn the halachas of the arba minim from the halachas of sukkah? Man de machshus over lo yolfinu lulav misukah, man de pasos over yolfinu lulav misukah. That really, the whole gezeres hakasav of tasav elomin ha'asoi is only written vis-a-vis the sukkah. It was never written vis-a-vis the arba minim. So the machlokas is, do we learn the laws of arba minim from sukkah, that the arba minim have to be assembled correctly the way sukkah does? Or do we not learn one from the other? And that's the machlokas. But really, maybe everyone holds in this brisa like Shmuel. So you have no raya that Rav has Tana to hang his hat on. The ibayasema. Alternatively, is virulon dululav tzarich eged kuli amalo pligi di alfina lulav misuka. V'hacha b'haka miflagi. Mar savar tzarich eged umar savar ein tzarich eged. So another way to understand the machlokas is does the arba minim have to be tied together or not? See, if you hold that the arba minim have to be tied together, so then everyone would hold that this is a problem because you're making the hadas kosher after the arba minim have been assembled. But what if there's a bichlala machlokas as to whether the arba minim have to be assembled at all? That's the machlokas. According to Reb Shimon, who says that it's possible, he says that since the arba minim have to be assembled, and it was assembled incorrectly, so therefore it's a problem of tasav elomina asoi. But the Chachamim who say it's kosher hold that arba minim never have to be assembled in the first place. So what's the big deal if you remove the berries? And it's that we know is a machlokas tanoim as far as the necessity to assemble the arba minim. The Tanya lulav bein agud bein she'eno agud kosher, and Rabbi Yehuda omer agud kosher she'eno agud pasel. That's machlokas the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. The Chachamim say it makes no difference whether it's assembled or unassembled; it's still kosher. And Rabbi Yehuda says no, it has to be assembled, meaning that you have to tie all arba minim together in order for it to be kosher. So Gemara now asks the question: my time of the Rabbi Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yehuda's reason to require that assembly? Yolef lekicha me agudas ezov. He learns a gzeira shava from the special hyssop brush that was used to paint the blood on the doorposts of the Jews during Makas Bechoros. The Torah says the verb ulakachtem ksiv hacha ulakachtem agudas ezov. It says you shall take a bunching together of hyssop brush, which teaches me that you can't just take a twigs that are not connected. You have to take a bunch that is tied together. And it says the same verbiage by the law of taking the arba minim. Malahalan ba'aguda, avkanami ba'aguda. That just like the hyssop brush has to be tied together, so too the arba minim have to be tied together. The Rabbanan lekicha melekicha lo yofina, but the Rabbanan have no such gezeira shava, and therefore they don't require that the arba minim have to be bunched together. And that's why they might hold that there's no problem of removing the berries because there's no assembly to talk about. And therefore, if there's no assembly to talk about, then there can be no deficiency of an improper assembly.
If one Rebbe has a tradition back from his Rabbanim all the way back,
and the other one doesn't.
When you say, it happens, we were dispersed, but my Rebbe has one, and his Rebbe, why don't you accept the Gezer Shava because my Rebbe told me?
Well, sometimes you do say that. The Gemara says, Im Kabbalah hi nekabel. If you have a tradition, we'll accept the tradition. But if you don't have a tradition, we'll argue with you.
It's Rabbi Yehuda,
though. Right. But, and that's actually a very valid question. I would assume that over here, the issue is that every Rebbe had an itemized list of which Gezeirah Shavas we make. And the Chachamim did not have this as part of their itemized list. And it could be there was a finite amount in every list, in every base medrash. So I'm assuming that that's the issue over here. It's not just that the Chachamim said we never heard that before, it's that, no, that's not on our list. And if it ain't on our list, it doesn't count. Okay? Now, but it could be there's another way to understand that. That's just the way it seems to me. Now, the Gemara says, Keman az lahadetanya lulav mitzvah la'ogdo v'im lo ogdo kosher. So the question now is, now that we have this machlokas between the Chachamim and Reb Yehuda, if the Arba Minim need to have an eged, need to be bunched together or not, we have another brisa which seems to go like neither. And because it says, lechatchila, you should tie it together, but b'di'evet, if you didn't tie it together, it's kosher. So, I Reb Yehuda, kilo agdu amai kosher, I rabbanan amai mitzvah. According to Reb Yehuda, why b'di'evet is it kosher? And according to the Chachamim, why lechatchila is there a mitzvah to tie it? The Gemara says, la'olam rabbanan hi, umishum shenamar zeh keli v'anvehu hisna lefanav b'mitzvahs. Answers the Gemara, in reality, this goes according to the Chachamim, who say that b'di'evet, that there's really no requirement to group it together. But they would agree that lechatchila, it is preferred to tie the Arba Minim together in order to fulfill the precept of this is my God and I will glorify Him. How do you glorify God? You do the mitzvah in the most aesthetically pleasing and beautifying way possible.
Which shows the chedivas of mitzvah. Is that the idea?
It's to show that
the love of the mitzvah.
Show that you love the mitzvah because you love the giver of the mitzvah. And so the way that you beautify the mitzvah of Arba Minim is by tying them together. Why is that called the beautification of the mitzvah? Number one, because it's organized, right? Number two, because we know that the Arba Minim represent all different types of Yidden, and you want to put them all together. That's another way of beautifying the mitzvah. Now, we paskin that you only have to group together the 3 out of the 4, and we'll learn about that later on, that you only have to group or bunch together in a knot or in a tie the 3, the lulav, hadas, and arava. The esrog does not have to be part of that aguda. So we'll learn about that shortly. Hisna'eh, beautify yourself.
Noah.
Right, make yourself no'eh, right, make yourself pleasing. Okay, zeh klal kol davar shemakabel tumah v'chulei. So this is the rule. Anything that is susceptible to tumah, because it's a kli or a food item, and it or it doesn't grow from the ground, then it cannot be used as chach. Minahani mili, where do we know this from? Amar Reish Lakish Amar Kra, because the pasuk says ve'ed ya'aleh min haaretz. It says by the story of creation, by the Garden of Eden, it says that a mist arose from the earth, the hishka, and it provided moisture for the garden. So what do we see from here? Ma'ed davar she'enu makabel tumah v'gidula min haaretz. Afsuka davar she'en makabel tumah v'gidula min haaretz. We see that a cloud or a mist, by its nature, is something that originates from the soil, and it is something that, by definition, cannot become tameh because it's ethereal. It's not an object that is subject to tumah. In a similar vein, since Sukkos is meant to emulate the clouds, what clouds? The clouds in the desert that protected the Jews. So therefore, the schach, which is the mainstay of the sukkah, has to be like a cloud. A cloud comes from the earth, so therefore it has to be vegetation, and it cannot be something that's subject to tumah.
So this is not dew, because dew is makabel tumah.
No, it's not dew. Aid is a mist.
So it's not okay.
Right. So the Gemara now says, Hanicha lamanda amar anane kavod hayu, elo lamanda amar sukkos mamish asu lahem ma'ika lameimar. So the Gemara says, but that only makes sense according to the opinion in the Machlokes that the reason why we sit in the sukkah is to commemorate the Anane HaKavod, the clouds of glory. But what about the opinion that the reason for the mitzvah of sukkahs is to commemorate the sukkahs that the Jews themselves constructed in the desert? The Tanya Kiva Sukkos Shaftius B'nai Yisrael, the famous Machlokes, that God says, sit in sukkahs for 7 days because I placed you in sukkahs when I took you out of Egypt. So the Machlokes is, what were these sukkos in the desert? Anane Kavod HaYudiv Rabbi Eliezer says that these were the clouds of glory, and Rabbi Akiva Omer Sukkos Mamish Asu Lahem. And Rabbi Akiva says, no, they constructed their own booths. It's a very important machlokas. There's a lot of agadita, a lot of drushes that are built upon this. Was it God who put us in the sukkahs, or we who protected ourselves in the sukkahs? And what are the ramifications of those two positions? And yet we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, as we know, the Shulchan Aruch actually cites Rabbi Eliezer as the real reason why we make the sukkahs. And the ramification is that when you build your sukkah and you sit in your sukkah, lechatchila, you have to have in mind not sukkahs mamish, but you have to have in mind, I'm doing this to commemorate the Anane HaKavod, the clouds of glory. But the point is, the Gemara says this connection to the mist of Gan Eden is only apt if a sukkah is a commemoration of the Anane HaKavod. But if it's not a commemoration of the Anani HaKavod, but the booths that the Jews made in the desert, how do you know that the schach that they used was pure vegetation? So the Gemara says, Hanicha l'Rebbe Eliezer, l'Rebbe Akiva ma'ikla. Remember, so what are you going to say according to Rabbi Akiva? So, Ki asa Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kra Chag HaSukkos Ta'aseh Lecha. The answer is because of that word Chag that we've seen before is a reference to the Korban Chagiga. So the Torah is connecting the Korban Chagiga, sacrificial animal, to the booths. Makir sukkah lechagiga, ma chagiga davar she'ino mekabel tumah v'gidul min haaretz. Just like a korban chagiga is made from an animal, and during its lifetime it's not subject to tumah, and it gets its sustenance from the earth, so it's considered to be coming from the ground. Meaning that because cows are herbivores, and those are the animals that are used for karbanos, so therefore they're considered to be from the ground. So too a sukkah has to be something that comes from the ground and is not subject to being makabel tumah. Now let me just clarify that according to this stage of the Gemara, it should be okay to use raw animal hide or other animal body parts as your schach. And of course we're going to see that that's not the halacha. The Gemara is going to reject this havamina because in the final analysis, even though an animal may get its nourishment from the ground, it's not considered to be gedulah min haaretz. And that's going to be the ensuing discussion, which will be this topic of tomorrow's DAF.